They were just looking for a home. But when a realtor refused to show them one because they were black, they didn't argue, they made a plan. And that plan turned into something no one saw coming. They bought the entire block. What happened next would change not just their lives, but the future of an entire neighborhood. This is a story of quiet resistance, bold vision, and the power of saying yes to yourself when the world keeps saying no. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below, and feel free to share your thoughts as we go. Your voice helps bring these stories to life, and we truly appreciate every single one of you joining us here. Now settle in, because this story is one you won't forget. The summer air hung thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant barbecue smoke as Harold Carter adjusted the collar of his shirt, eyes scanning the row of townhomes outside his window. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the quiet street, making even the cracked sidewalks and rusted fire hydrants look nostalgic. In the next room, Denise was humming a tune as she packed away their daughter's school supplies, her movements deliberate and soft like someone folding up a chapter of their life. Harold and Denise had spent the last 9 years in their 2-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city, where sirens and arguments were as common as the clatter of dishes and the laughter of kids playing tag in the alleyways. It wasn't bad, just no longer enough. Their daughter Maya had just turned 7, bright-eyed and curious, asking questions that always led them back to the same conclusion. It was time to go. Time to find a place where she could ride her bike without fear, where she could sleep through the night without gunshots waking her, where they could all breathe a little easier. Harold had been working double shifts at the post office, stacking overtime like bricks, while Denise kept her small hair salon running out of the back of their building. They'd saved every spare dollar, eaten more peanut butter than they cared to admit, skipped vacations, postponed car repairs, and said, "not yet," to nearly every indulgence. But finally it was here, the moment they had dreamed about since before they even said, "I do." The prospect of a home. Not just any home, but a real home with a yard, a porch swing, and a neighborhood that didn't shrink when you walked down the sidewalk. Harold had always believed in preparing before pouncing, so he'd done his homework. Mortgage calculators, school district rankings, property tax histories. His notebook was full of numbers and addresses. Denise, the heart to his head, had already picked out color palettes and kitchen tile styles in her mind. Even bookmarked pages from a Better Homes and Gardens issue she borrowed from the library. They weren't just buying a house, they were shaping their legacy. One quiet Friday evening, as cicadas hummed and Maya sat drawing cartoons at the kitchen table, Harold leaned forward with that familiar fire in his eyes and said, "Let's set the appointment. Let's go find our home." Denise met his gaze with the same quiet strength that had carried them through every challenge. "It's time," she whispered, reaching across the table to take his hand. They had found a listing through a local real estate agency in Crestview, a suburban neighborhood that shimmered with promise. Tree-lined streets, top-rated schools, low crime, high community engagement. It seemed like the American dream wrapped in vinyl siding and well-trimmed hedges. The online photos showed sun-drenched living rooms, spacious backyards, and neighbors walking golden retrievers past lemonade stands. It looked almost too good to be true, and for once they dared to believe it might not be. The following Monday they dressed their best. Harold wore his crisp navy button-up and freshly polished shoes. Denise styled her hair into soft curls, applied a hint of lipstick, and put Maya in her Sunday dress. They wanted to show they were serious, responsible, and ready, not because they had anything to prove, but because years of navigating subtle discrimination had taught them to always be 10 steps ahead. As they pulled into the agency parking lot, Harold gave Denise's hand a small squeeze. "We've earned this," he said, almost to himself. Inside the office, they were greeted by a receptionist with a smile that faltered only slightly as she looked up. She gestured toward the waiting area and said someone would be with them shortly. They sat on a leather couch under framed photos of sunlit properties, their fingers interlocked, their nerves dancing with anticipation. Everything about the room whispered professionalism and possibility. This, they thought, was what progress looked like. In that moment, they weren't just a black couple looking to buy a house. They were a family moving toward something larger than themselves. A new chapter, a step forward, a dream finally within reach. And in that quiet waiting room, wrapped in the scent of fresh coffee and laminate flooring, Harold and Denise had no idea that what waited beyond the glass door was not a welcome mat, but a wall. A wall that had been standing long before they arrived, invisible but immovable, waiting to remind them that, for some, the American dream came with conditions. But for now, they smiled at each other, hopeful, unaware. The dream had begun. The door to the office finally opened with a soft chime, and in stepped a tall, lean man in a tailored gray suit. His thinning blonde hair slicked back with precision. He moved with the kind of ease that came from years of closing deals and charming families, and his smile was wide but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Walter Grayson," he said, extending a firm hand. "Pleasure to meet you." Harold stood, offering a confident handshake, and Denise followed, introducing themselves with the warm politeness they'd mastered over the years. Walter's eyes flicked down to Maya, then quickly back up. Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to leave a trace of chill in the room. "Right this way," he said, motioning them to his office. They followed him past a row of desks and into a private space decorated with golf trophies, framed certificates, and a large map of the city divided by red, blue, and green zones. Harold noticed a corner of the map with red lines outlining the very neighborhoods he and Denise had flagged as promising. Walter sat behind his desk, flipping through a slim folder, though his tone had already begun to cool. "So," he said, glancing at them briefly, "you mentioned online that you were interested in Crestview?" Denise nodded. "Yes, there were a few listings we found on your site. The one on Birchwood Lane looked perfect. 3 bedrooms, fenced yard, close to the school." Walter's lips tightened slightly. "Ah, that one. Yes, well, unfortunately, that property's just gone under contract. Very popular area. Things move fast around here." "What about the house on Meadowview?" Harold asked, pulling out a list. "And this one on Lake Hill Drive?" Walter glanced down, then shook his head. "Also off the market. In fact, I'm afraid most of Crestview is in very high demand. Not much inventory left, but I'd be happy to show you some alternatives. There are some really up-and-coming neighborhoods just 10 minutes east. Great value, diverse community." His voice lingered on that last phrase. Denise frowned slightly. "Those aren't the neighborhoods we're interested in," she said gently. "We'd really like to see Crestview." Walter leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Look, I don't want to waste your time. Families who tend to thrive in Crestview usually, well, let's just say the community has a certain rhythm. People there are very close-knit, very traditional. It's not just about the house, it's about the fit." There it was. Not loud, not vulgar, but clear as glass. Denise sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Harold felt a tightness in his chest he hadn't expected. "We qualify," he said evenly. "We've been pre-approved. We have excellent credit. Our daughter deserves the same chance at a safe neighborhood as anyone else's." Walter smiled, but it was a smile that curved without warmth. "Of course. I'm just saying, why not consider areas where you'll feel more comfortable? Less resistance. Places that are growing in their own way." Harold stared at him, the silence stretching. In that moment, he saw the truth behind the practiced charm. Walter wasn't just making assumptions, he was upholding an unspoken code, one passed down from broker to broker, neighbor to neighbor, a code that said some people simply didn't belong. Denise stood first, smoothing down her dress with graceful dignity. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice calm. Harold followed, offering a clipped nod. "We'll look elsewhere." As they walked back to the car, Maya clutched her mother's hand, her innocent eyes confused. "Why didn't we see the house?" she asked. Harold paused, then crouched to meet her gaze. "Sometimes, baby," he said softly, "people forget what fairness means, but we don't have to." The car ride home was quiet, filled with the weight of what had just happened. Denise stared out the window, her fingers trembling slightly. "All this time," she murmured, "I thought we'd moved past this." Harold didn't answer. His jaw was set, his grip on the steering wheel firm. Inside, Something had ignited, not anger, not yet, but a kind of sharp clarity. He'd tried to follow the rules, to do everything right. He'd believed that hard work could earn them a seat at the table. But the truth had knocked on their door today, wearing a tailored suit and a thin smile. It said, "You're not welcome," not in so many words, but loud enough. That night, while Maya slept and Denise paced the kitchen, Harold sat alone with a pen and notepad. He wasn't thinking about another neighborhood. He was thinking about possibility, about pushing back not with fists but with vision. If the gatekeepers wouldn't let them in, what if they built their own gate? A question began to form, quiet and bold. What if they didn't just buy a house? What if they bought the whole block? The idea was barely formed, but it pulsed with promise. Not revenge, not spite, purpose. And in that flicker of possibility, a new dream was born. One no realtor could deny. The city lights blurred into golden smears on the windshield as Harold drove through the familiar streets of their old neighborhood. The hum of the engine, the only sound filling the silence between him and Denise. Maya had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head tilted against the window, her little hand curled around the corner of her dress. Denise kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, her mind clearly miles away, somewhere between the sting of Walter's words and the coldness of his smile. Harold's fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter with every passing block, the muscles in his jaw working silently. His silence wasn't from lack of emotion but from too much of it. He didn't trust his voice not to shake. They pulled into their apartment complex, the street lamp flickering overhead like it always did, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Harold killed the engine but didn't move. Denise sat still for a moment before opening her door and gently lifting Maya out of the back seat. The child stirred, then nestled into her mother's shoulder, unaware of the bitter shift that had taken place in her parents' hearts. Inside their unit, the walls felt narrower somehow, the ceiling lower, the air heavier. Denise laid Maya in bed and smoothed her hair back, brushing a kiss against her forehead. She stood there for a long moment afterward, watching their daughter sleep, her chest rising and falling with small, peaceful breaths. When she returned to the living room, she found Harold sitting on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The coffee table still held the real estate brochures they'd printed, a hopeful collage of dreams now crumpled under the weight of what they'd endured. Denise sat beside him and took his hand. Her voice came out soft, measured, but the hurt in it was sharp. "I really thought it would be different this time. We had the money. We had everything lined up. We did everything right." Harold didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed on the floor, but his mind was turning over the memory of Walter's words. Those cool, clipped phrases that said everything while saying nothing. People like us, he thought bitterly, aren't supposed to cross that invisible line. Not into Crestview. Not into their storybook neighborhoods with welcome signs that don't really mean welcome. "It wasn't about the house," Harold finally said, his voice low. "It was about being told no, like we didn't belong, like we didn't earn it, like our daughter doesn't deserve safety and space because of who her parents are." Denise leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We've worked so hard," she said, and her voice trembled just enough to let the pain leak through. "We saved and planned and dreamed. And the moment we stepped into that office, it all got stripped down to what we looked like." Harold wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. The humiliation of the day settled on them like a second skin. One they were all too familiar with, but one they had hoped they'd outgrown. It wasn't new, but it cut deeper this time because now there was a child involved, and dreams deferred tasted different when they weren't just yours anymore. Later that night, after Denise had gone to bed and the apartment had grown quiet, Harold stayed awake, the room dim except for the glow of a small lamp beside the couch. He opened a worn notebook, the same one he'd used to jot down house listings, and flipped to a blank page. For a long moment, he didn't write anything. He just stared at the emptiness of the paper. But something was stirring in him, something old and familiar, like the spirit that carried his grandfather through the marches in Selma or his mother through double shifts as a nurse while raising 3 boys alone. He had always believed in rising above, in walking with dignity no matter how heavy the weight. But tonight, he was done walking politely around closed doors. That look on Walter's face, it wasn't just a rejection. It was a message. One meant to keep him in his place. And Harold had no intention of staying there. Slowly, he began to write. Not houses this time, but questions. What if ownership didn't mean waiting for approval? What if safety and dignity weren't luxuries handed out by gatekeepers? What if their daughter never had to see her parents humiliated again just for wanting more? The questions grew into ideas, and the ideas began to root. The pain of the day still throbbed, but beneath it, something else had taken hold. A kind of quiet defiance, not loud or vengeful, but deeply rooted in the belief that their worth wasn't up for debate. That the answer to rejection wasn't retreat, it was redirection. Denise emerged from the bedroom in her robe, surprised to find him still up. "What are you doing?" she asked gently. Harold looked up at her, then back at the notebook. "Thinking," he said. "Maybe we're looking at this all wrong. Maybe we don't need their houses. Maybe we need our own plan." Denise raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "What kind of plan?" He gave her a small, tired smile. "Something bigger. Something bold." And though she didn't know what he meant just yet, the way he said it made her believe that maybe, just maybe, humiliation wasn't where their story ended. It might just be where the real story began. Morning sunlight filtered in through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room floor as Harold stirred his coffee in silence. The air still felt heavy with the sting of yesterday, but beneath that weight something else had started to simmer. Something bold, something dangerous in its ambition and yet utterly necessary. Denise sat across from him at the small kitchen table, still in her robe, flipping absently through the notebook Harold had scribbled in the night before. The lines were messy, more like sketches of thought than plans, but even in their rawness, they pulsed with something electric. "By the block?" she said, not looking up. "Is that really what you wrote?" Harold leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Not the whole city, just one block, one we control, one we shape. A place where families like ours don't have to knock and wait for someone else to open the door." Denise raised an eyebrow, skepticism flickering behind her tired eyes. "Harold, we've been saving for one house. One. We can't just multiply that dream by 10. "Why not?" he shot back gently. "What if we're not supposed to squeeze into someone else's neighborhood? What if we build our own? Not out of spite, but out of vision. What if Maya grows up on a street where every family looks out for one another, where no one gets turned away because they don't fit a certain image?" Denise exhaled slowly, rubbing her forehead. "It's a beautiful idea, Harold, but it's not just about the dream. It's about reality. We'd need capital, permits. We'd need banks to even look at us." Harold gave a small nod, the kind that conceded the obstacle but not the outcome. "I know, but I've already started looking into it. There are older neighborhoods not far from here where the city's trying to offload abandoned properties. The land is cheap, dilapidated, sure, but the bones are strong. What if we bought them up, fixed them, and made something real?" Denise was quiet. She turned another page in the notebook. More scribbles, addresses, numbers, city council meeting dates, even the name of a local loan officer Harold remembered from a church event years ago. He had stayed up most of the night mapping it all out, not because he believed it would be easy, but because he needed something, anything, to believe in. "It's not revenge," he said quietly. "It's redemption. Not just for us, but for every couple that walks into an office like that and gets turned away without cause. If we can't get in their way, maybe we make a new way." Denise looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "If we do this," she said, "we do it together. Every step." That afternoon, they picked Maya up early from school and drove through the part of town Harold had marked in his notebook. A stretch of forgotten blocks where the paint peeled from porches and weeds grew through chain-link fences. The neighborhood had been beautiful once, that much was clear. Wide lots, old trees, the kind of craftsmanship that modern homes couldn't replicate. Now it was mostly shadows of itself. Vacant buildings, broken windows, plywood nailed to door frames. But Harold didn't see blight. He saw blueprints. Denise rolled down the window, letting the breeze carry in the scent of grass and something older, like history. "This is where you want to start?" she asked. Harold nodded. "This is where we plant the seed." Over the next several days, they started laying groundwork. Harold visited the city records office, poring over public listings and tax liens. Denise made calls to building inspectors, trying to find out what code violations might stand in their way. They discovered that a handful of properties on one block, 6 homes and 2 lots, had been sitting unclaimed for over a year. If they moved fast and smart, they might just be able to secure them before a developer swooped in. Of course, that would require capital, and therein lay the real mountain. They took meetings with local banks, arriving dressed in their best with binders full of plans. They spoke with loan officers who smiled too easily, their eyes glazing over as soon as they saw the zip code of the proposed investment. "It's just not viable," one banker said with a sympathetic shrug. "That neighborhood's past saving." Another waved them off with condescension disguised as caution. "This kind of scale is outside your profile," he told Harold. "Have you considered just buying a fixer-upper in a safer area instead?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. Know your place, dream smaller, accept the limits. But Harold and Denise didn't flinch. Each rejection only sharpened their resolve. At night, they returned home and recalibrated, adjusting budgets, finding workarounds, calling in every contact they could think of. Denise sold off a chunk of her salon equipment to build their reserve fund. Harold took on weekend shifts unloading trucks. They weren't just chasing a dream anymore. They were building it from scratch, brick by invisible brick. One evening, as they sat side by side on the couch surrounded by folders and spreadsheets, Maya crawled into Denise's lap with her picture book. "Are we really going to get a new house?" she asked. Denise looked down at her and smiled. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We are. But not just a house. A neighborhood." Harold met her eyes, and for the first time in days, they both smiled. Not because the road ahead was easy, but because it finally felt like it belonged to them. They arrived at the bank 15 minutes early, Harold in his best suit with the collar starched just right and Denise wearing a soft blue dress that made her look both graceful and determined. The binder she carried was thick with every detail of their plan. Property values, renovation budgets, projected equity, even a mission statement that spoke of community renewal and generational wealth. It wasn't just a pitch. It was a promise backed by data and conviction. They were met by a young loan officer named Mr. Higgins, who smiled politely and led them into a glass-walled office that smelled faintly of printer toner and polished ambition. Harold placed the binder neatly on the desk, watching as Mr. Higgins opened it and flipped through the pages with mechanical nods, making sounds of interest but never once truly engaging. "This is quite the undertaking," he said finally, tapping the financials page. "Buying and rehabilitating 8 properties in a concentrated area. Have either of you done anything like this before?" Denise smiled patiently. "We've never taken on this scale, but we've been small business owners for years. I run a salon. Harold's managed projects through the post office union. We've done our research. We've consulted contractors. We're ready." Mr. Higgins gave another nod, but his fingers were already closing the binder. "It's impressive," he said, "but we typically like to see a few more financial assets, some cushion in case the market doesn't cooperate." Harold leaned forward. "You have our credit reports. Our payment history is spotless. We're not asking for a handout, just a chance." Mr. Higgins offered a practiced frown, the kind people give when pretending to empathize. "I'm afraid the risk profile is just too high for us. It's not a matter of credit. It's the neighborhood. The comps in that area are underwhelming." "That's the point," Harold said, trying to keep his voice level. "We're not investing in what it is, we're investing in what it can be." Mr. Higgins stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said, "but this just doesn't align with our current lending strategy." Outside, the sun had grown hotter, the sky cloudless and cruel. They sat in the car in silence for a few moments before Denise finally said, "We'll try another." And they did. They tried 4 others, then 5. They dressed up. They rehearsed. They sharpened their proposal. But each time the result was the same. Some rejections were dressed in soft language about risk assessment and market volatility. Others were more direct, with condescending smiles and phrases like, "You people need to be realistic," or "This just isn't the kind of thing we'd expect from a couple with your background." The doors closed one after another, and each time, it got harder to get back in the car. Harder to hold their heads high when they walked past the teller windows where customers waited in line to deposit checks and get mortgages for homes in neighborhoods where Harold and Denise weren't welcome. Not because they lacked the means, but because they weren't supposed to change the shape of the world around them. There were nights when Harold lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were trying to move a mountain with their bare hands. There were mornings when Denise couldn't even look at the binder anymore, afraid that touching it would mean touching disappointment all over again. Maya started asking when they were going to move. "I told my teacher we're getting a new house," she said one morning over cereal. "She said I should draw it." "What should I draw?" Harold smiled and kissed the top of her head. "Draw a big porch," he said, "with flowers all around it." But later, he sat in the bathroom with the door closed and his head in his hands, because the truth was that he didn't know if that porch would ever exist. Still, they kept going. Denise cut her salon hours back and started freelancing for a local interior decorator to learn more about property staging. Harold used his weekends to visit open houses, not to buy, but to learn, to study finishes, floor plans, and conversations between agents and buyers. They weren't just fighting a system. They were educating themselves so thoroughly that no one could ever say again, "You're not ready." Their persistence started to attract whispers at church, in the neighborhood, even at the post office. Some people admired them. Others shook their heads and warned them to stop chasing pipe dreams. "Don't get yourselves in trouble," an older neighbor told Denise one day. "You start stepping into places you're not supposed to be, and they'll make you pay for it." Denise smiled sweetly. "Then we'll pay for it," she said. But the truth was, each no came with a cost. Their savings were thinning. Their energy was fraying. And though neither said it aloud, the question began to settle between them like a shadow. What if the mountain doesn't move? Then one Sunday after service, an elderly man in a charcoal suit approached Harold as he held the door for a line of churchgoers. He extended a weathered hand and introduced himself with a quiet confidence. "Elijah Walker," he said. "I heard you're trying to buy a block." Harold blinked, taken aback. "Yes, sir. That's right." Mr. Walker smiled. "Then let's talk. I think I might know a way to help." And just like that, after a string of doors slammed shut, a new one creaked open, wider than the rest and full of possibility. The following Tuesday evening, just as the sun began to slip behind the church steeple and the air carried that quiet stillness only found in fading light, Harold found himself sitting in the back booth of Earl's Diner across from Elijah Walker, a man whose presence filled the space without effort. His suit, though a little worn at the cuffs, carried the pride of a generation that believed you dressed with intention. His eyes were sharp beneath silver brows, and his voice had the kind of gravelly weight that made people lean in when he spoke. The waitress brought coffee, and Mr. Walker stirred in 2 sugars with the care of a man who had done this ritual for decades. "I've been watching you," he said simply, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "Heard about the banks turning you down. Heard about the binder you carry into every meeting. I know you're kind. Not by skin, by spirit. You remind me of myself." Harold listened, respectful but cautious. He had been warned before about older men who offered advice dressed as help, only to discourage ambition cloaked in experience. But Mr. Walker was different. He didn't speak to lecture. He spoke to invite. "You know, I was one of the first black VPs at Union Federal?" he continued, sipping his coffee. 32 years in the banking world. I've seen every excuse they give folks like us, and I've learned how to read between their words. They don't say no because of numbers. They say no because they've already decided who deserves yes. Denise joined them a few minutes later, apologizing for running late, and Mr. Walker stood as she arrived, ever the gentleman. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that this meeting wasn't about nostalgia or sympathy. Mr. Walker had contacts, old ones, quiet ones, who owed him favors or at least enough respect to listen. He knew the channels where private capital flowed beneath the surface, away from boardrooms and press releases. You won't get it all from one place, he warned. You'll have to piece it together like a quilt. Some from here, some from there. Might have to deal with people you don't like. But if you're willing to fight smart, not just hard, you might just pull this off. Harold and Denise exchanged a glance, and for the first time in weeks, there was something more than fatigue in their eyes. There was light. Over the next several weeks, Mr. Walker became more than an advisor, he became family. He sat with them in strategy sessions at their kitchen table, reviewing loan terms and property bids with a red pen and a meticulousness that could rival any auditor. He introduced them to a former colleague who now worked in private lending, a woman named Cassandra Reyes, who agreed to back a portion of their proposal after just one meeting. Cassandra wasn't interested in flattery or hope. She wanted facts, projections, and grit, and Harold and Denise brought all three. Then came the city permits. Mr. Walker, who had once helped rewrite portions of the city's zoning policies during the 90s, accompanied them to council meetings and taught them how to speak the language of bureaucracy. They'll try to delay you, he said. Red tape, paperwork, hearing dates. Don't let it wear you down. Every delay is a test of your patience, not your plan. At one point, when a zoning board member suggested a background check for community investment applicants, Harold saw Denise's face tighten with indignation. But before she could speak, Mr. Walker raised a slow, deliberate eyebrow, and the room fell silent. You don't ask for background checks from developers building liquor stores and pawn shops, he said calmly. Why now? No one answered, and the policy was quietly shelved. Maya, too, became close to Mr. Walker, drawn to his stories and the gentle way he always made her feel like she was part of something important. Do you think I could be mayor one day? She asked him one Sunday afternoon as he helped her plant flowers in a small garden box outside their apartment. He chuckled, patting the soil. Why not president? Don't let the size of the world tell you the size of your dreams. With funding trickling in and legal hurdles slowly clearing, properties began falling into place. The first house was secured through auction, the second through a distressed sale, the third through a private listing that Mr. Walker's network uncovered before it hit the market. Every acquisition felt like a tiny rebellion, a reclaiming of space long abandoned not by time, but by intention. Yet through all the progress, Mr. Walker kept them grounded. Don't build out of anger, he warned one night as they celebrated the third closing. Build out of purpose. The world doesn't change when you shout at it. It changes when you reshape it so quietly, so deliberately, that by the time they notice, it already belongs to you. That night, Harold stood in the center of the empty living room of their newest property. Floors stripped bare, walls cracked, ceilings bowed. He could see the decay, yes, but more than that, he saw the light streaming in through dusty windows, the echoes of laughter waiting to return. With Mr. Walker by their side, it wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The block was beginning to take shape, and so was their legacy. The paper was old, the ink faint, but as Harold signed his name at the bottom of the closing document, his hand steady and firm, it felt as though he were carving something into stone. The first house, battered, neglected, leaning tiredly to one side, was officially theirs. Denise stood beside him, her eyes glistening as she held Maya's hand, and Mr. Walker sat nearby in a metal chair, his arms crossed in quiet satisfaction. The notary, a middle-aged woman who had clearly seen hundreds of closings, looked between them and smiled, perhaps not fully understanding the magnitude of the moment, but sensing the weight in the room. When it was done, Harold exhaled the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't move-in ready, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. Later that day, the three of them drove to the house with the keys in Harold's hand like a badge of honor. The porch sagged slightly under their steps, the front door creaked on its hinges, and a family of squirrels had clearly made the attic their home. But even through the dust and peeling wallpaper, there was promise in every room. Harold walked through the hallways slowly, touching the doorframes as if greeting old friends. Denise opened each window to let in air and light, her footsteps soft and reverent. Maya skipped through the bare living room, her laughter echoing off the empty walls as she imagined where her drawings would go, and where they might put her reading nook. They spent the afternoon in work clothes, sweeping debris, peeling up old carpet, and taking inventory of what needed to be done. Mr. Walker arrived with sandwiches and lemonade, watching from the porch with the look of a man remembering a life's worth of firsts. "This house," he said as Harold joined him to eat, "was built by a black carpenter in 1926. Raised 6 kids here. That front porch used to have a swing. I remember it. His wife would sit there every summer, snapping peas." Harold looked out at the street. "Feels like we're bringing something back," he said. Mr. Walker nodded. "Not bringing it back. Reclaiming it." That night, they brought folding chairs and sat under the porch light, now fixed by Harold's steady hand. The breeze was soft, the stars clear, and for a few brief hours, the weight of obstacles lifted just enough to breathe easy. Neighbors walked by, some with curiosity, others with recognition. One elderly man named Marvin, whose house was 2 doors down, stopped and introduced himself. "You the ones bought the Jenkins place?" he asked. Harold stood. "Yes, sir. Just closed today." Marvin smiled, a gap in his front teeth showing. "About time someone cared enough to fix it. That house used to sing, you know. Laughter, music, cookouts on Saturdays. I hope you bring all that back." Denise invited him to sit for a moment, and he did, telling stories of the block back when it was alive, when kids played stickball in the street and neighbors looked out for each other without needing to be asked. "Then the city forgot about us," Marvin said with a shrug. "Stores left. Schools fell apart. People moved away or gave up. But maybe y'all are what we've been waiting for." It was the kind of encouragement that settled in the bones. The kind that made all the bruises of rejection and fatigue worth enduring. Over the next week, Harold and Denise began work in earnest. They hired a local crew, black-owned, recommended by Mr. Walker, and brought in an electrician, a roofer, and a young woman named Sierra who specialized in historic restorations. The money came in careful drips, from Cassandra Reyes's partial loan, from Denise's remaining savings, and from a grant Mr. Walker helped them secure through a local community renewal program. Every dollar had to be stretched. Every decision mattered. They painted the living room a warm sunflower yellow. They replaced the broken windows with new ones that let in light without losing charm. They uncovered original hardwood floors beneath the dust and rot, polishing them until they gleamed like they had a century ago. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was honest work. And with each nail hammered, each wall patched, they weren't just fixing a house. They were rewriting a narrative that had long been abandoned. Maya helped plant flowers along the walkway, daisies and marigolds in little clusters that would greet every passerby with color. She placed a painted stone at the base of the porch step that read, "Hope lives here." And when Harold saw it, he had to step away for a moment so she wouldn't see the emotion flicker across his face. The day they finally moved in, it wasn't with fanfare or grand speeches. It was with boxes carried by hand, by the quiet gratitude of hard work fulfilled. That night, they lay in bed with the windows open, listening not to traffic or sirens, but to the wind brushing through the trees. And for the first time in years, Harold fell asleep without planning the next move, because for the first time they were home. One house down, a block still to go. But this was the beginning. And beginnings, when born of purpose, have a way of shaking the world. It started with one house, but like the first drop of rain in a long-awaited storm, the change began to ripple. The Jenkins house, once silent and sagging, now stood freshly painted and full of life, its yellow walls catching sunlight in a way that made people slow down when they passed. The porch had a new swing, just like Mr. Walker remembered, and every Saturday morning, Maya could be seen watering the flowers out front while Denise sipped her coffee and waved to neighbors walking their dogs or pushing strollers. There was no grand announcement, no ribbon cutting or media crew, but word spread, not just about the family who moved in, but about what they were doing, what they were building. People started showing up. First it was Marvin, bringing over a battered toolbox and offering to help fix the fence out back. Then came Tanya from 2 streets over, asking if they needed someone who could sew curtains or reupholster chairs. A teenage boy named Dre knocked one afternoon, asking if he could mow the lawn for free, just to be part of something good. Even the crew Harold had hired for the restoration began staying late, not because they were paid overtime, but because they believed in what the project meant. Harold and Denise, once cautious with their hope, now found themselves racing to keep up with the pace. With each new home they acquired, whether through auction, direct sale, or whispered tip from someone who believed in the cause, they repeated the process. Secure the structure. Clean out the debris. Rebuild from the bones up. Paint, tile, restore. But more than that, they began to reimagine. Not just the homes themselves, but the block. They planted trees between the sidewalks, small ones at first, but with the promise of shade for years to come. They installed benches made from reclaimed wood, added solar lights along the pathways, and worked with a local artist collective to begin a mural on the side of the third house. A sweeping image of Black history, hope, and community rising together. When the mural began to take shape, people started visiting from other neighborhoods. Some just to look, others to ask questions. "Who's in charge?" they would ask. And Harold would smile and say, "All of us." There were challenges, of course. Not everyone was pleased. A developer who had been eyeing the same stretch of properties tried to muscle in with slick offers and rumors meant to scare owners into selling fast. At one point, a zoning dispute nearly halted construction when an anonymous complaint claimed the renovations were violating historical codes. But every time an obstacle appeared, Mr. Walker was there, steady and strategic. He taught them how to build coalitions, how to document every step, how to make allies out of skeptics. Denise took the lead on organizing block meetings, inviting longtime residents to voice their needs and dreams. She created a vision board in the front room of the Jenkins house with color-coded pins and sticky notes mapping out future gardens, community centers, and even a tiny library in a former toolshed. "This isn't just for us," she said one evening as neighbors gathered in folding chairs. "This is for the people who were here long before we came, and the ones who'll come long after we're gone." Harold stood beside her, pride radiating from him in waves. Each word she spoke seemed to give breath to something bigger than themselves. The momentum wasn't just growth, it was resurrection. One night, as they walked the block hand in hand, Harold looked around at the houses lit from within, some already occupied, others in progress, and said, "Do you realize we're halfway there?" Denise stopped walking, surprised. "Already?" He nodded. For homes occupied, 2 more being restored, and 2 more in negotiation. 8 total. The whole block. She looked around slowly, taking it in. The laughter spilling from a front porch where neighbors played cards. The smell of something rich and spicy wafting from a window. The faint beat of music from a garage where teenagers practiced drums and guitar. "It's starting to feel like a village," she whispered. Harold smiled. "A village we built." Maya ran ahead of them, chasing fireflies with a jar in her hand, her laughter bright and unburdened. It was in that sound, pure and free, that they heard the clearest evidence of what they were building. Not just a collection of houses, not just resistance against rejection, but a sanctuary of dignity. A living, breathing testament to what happens when people stop asking for permission to dream. As the stars blinked above and the trees rustled in the summer wind, Denise looked at Harold with a gentle, knowing smile. "We should name it," she said. "The block. It deserves a name." Harold thought for a moment, then replied, "What about Harmony Row?" Denise nodded slowly, the name settling between them like roots into earth. "Harmony Row," she repeated, "where hope lives and history breathes." And from that night on, it was no longer just a project. It was a place, a movement, a future written in paint and sweat and dreams no one could deny. It was a Thursday morning when the email arrived, nestled between utility bills and contractor updates in Denise's inbox. The subject line read simply, "Media Inquiry Harmony Row." She nearly deleted it, thinking it spam or a real estate ad in disguise, but something made her open it. A reporter from the Baltimore Herald, a young woman named Karina Miles, had heard about their project through a local artist who worked on the mural. She wanted to come see it, to walk the block and hear the story firsthand. Denise stared at the screen, her heart suddenly heavier than she expected. Public attention hadn't been part of the plan. They hadn't built Harmony Row to make headlines. They had built it because they were tired of being told no. But still, she forwarded the email to Harold, and when he got home that night, they talked about it over dinner, Maya drawing unicorns in her sketchbook beside them. "Do we want this?" Denise asked, her voice low. "Do we want the world looking in?" Harold took a long sip of water before answering. "I think we owe it to the people who never got this far. Maybe it's time folks saw what we've been doing. Not just the houses. The why." And so, 2 days later, Karina Miles arrived with a notebook, a quiet smile, and a camera that she kept slung around her shoulder like it was an extension of her. She was younger than they expected, barely 30, with tightly braided hair and a sharpness in her eyes that reminded Harold of Denise when they first met. She didn't ask for a tour immediately. Instead, she sat with them on the front porch of the Jenkins house, listening. For nearly an hour, Harold and Denise spoke, not in rehearsed statements or sound bites, but in the raw, plain language of people who had been through fire and built something beautiful from the ash. They told her about the real estate office, about Walter's smirk, about the first no and the 100 tiny barriers that had followed. They told her about Mr. Walker and Cassandra and the neighbors who had shown up not because of money, but because of belief. Karina listened without interrupting, only nodding, jotting notes, asking gentle questions when necessary. Then she walked the block, taking pictures of the mural, of the flower beds Maya had planted, of the swing on the porch that creaked just slightly in the breeze. She spoke to Marvin and Tanya, to Dre and Sierra, and even to little Maya, who told her all about her dream to turn one of the sheds into a book castle for neighborhood kids. The article ran a week later under the headline, "From Rejection to Renewal, the couple rebuilding a block and a dream." The story spread faster than they ever imagined. Within days, it was picked up by local radio, then by national outlets, then by a morning talk show that invited Harold and Denise to speak via video call. Their phones rang nonstop. Emails flooded in. Some were from aspiring families asking how to replicate the model. Others were from volunteers offering to help. A few were from donors who wanted to contribute materials, tools, even money. But not all the attention was warm. One evening, they found a folded note on the windshield of Harold's truck that read, "Stay in your place." Another time, a city inspector showed up unannounced and spent 3 hours combing through permits, clearly fishing for violations. "You're making waves," Mr. Walker said when they told him, "and waves disturb still water. But don't let it scare you. Let it prove you're moving." Harold nodded, but he felt the pressure building. The kind of pressure that comes when eyes are watching, waiting for you to fail. And yet, something else began to happen too. Realtors who had once ignored them now called to ask if they wanted assistance acquiring more lots. Local businesses began reaching out to sponsor community events. A high school art teacher asked if she could bring her class to visit the mural and learn about community-driven change. What had started as resistance was now becoming recognition. And with recognition came responsibility. Denise began organizing Saturday workshops, teaching homeownership basics, financial literacy, and renovation tips to anyone who showed up. Harold partnered with a nearby church to create a tool library, lending equipment to neighbors working on their own homes. Harmony Row wasn't just a story anymore. It was a model. It was proof that dignity didn't require permission. One night, after a long day of meetings and media calls, Harold sat on the porch beside Denise and watched the block breathe. The mural was now complete, a brilliant burst of color that wrapped around the corner lot like a ribbon tying the past to the present. Maya was inside reading to a group of kids from the neighborhood, her voice drifting through the open window like music. "We didn't ask for this attention," Denise said, leaning her head on Harold's shoulder. "But maybe it was always going to come." Harold nodded slowly. "Let them look," he whispered. "Let them see what we do when we're left alone long enough to grow." And with the porch light glowing above them and the hum of community all around, it felt less like exposure and more like a spotlight finally shining where it belonged. The sun was still rising when Harold stepped onto the porch that morning, a mug of hot coffee in his hand and the sound of birds fluttering between trees they had planted not even a year ago. The block, still quiet in those early hours, felt different now. settled yet alive, humming with purpose in every corner. Harmony Row was no longer an idea or even a project. It had become a living community, and with each new family that moved in, it grew stronger, louder, more visible. And yet, something had shifted, not in the foundation beneath their feet, but in the forces gathering beyond it. It began subtly, almost unnoticeably. A for sale sign went up on the corner property, one they hadn't heard about. Then 2 days later, a second. The lots weren't part of their plan yet, but they were connected to the block close enough that if the wrong hands got hold of them, everything they'd built could be put at risk. Denise made a call to the city records office and found that both properties had been sold in quiet cash deals to a holding company based in another state. The name on the paperwork meant nothing. One of those blank corporate shells with a vaguely patriotic title and a Delaware address. But the timing was too precise to be coincidence. "They've seen the headlines," Mr. Walker said grimly when they met that evening. "They want in, and they don't want to join you. They want to outbid, overbuild, and push you out with a smile." Harold leaned over the table, his fingers laced tightly together. "How do we stop it?" Mr. Walker looked at him with a weight in his eyes. "You fight with leverage, and right now your greatest weapon is community. If they think they can divide the neighborhood, make a better offer so some doubt, play people against each other, they'll try. But if you can prove this block is more than a few fixed-up houses, if you can prove it's united, they won't have a foothold." The next few days became a whirlwind. Denise organized a neighborhood council on the front lawn, folding chairs stretching from curb to porch. People showed up in droves, families, elders, teenagers, business owners. They listened as she and Harold explained what was happening, not with panic, but with clarity. "We aren't just building homes," she said firmly. "We're building power, the kind they're not used to seeing in neighborhoods like ours." A retired attorney who lived 2 blocks over offered pro bono help drafting a legal challenge to slow the development. A local pastor spoke at Sunday service about stewardship and how community wasn't a commodity to be flipped for profit. Dre and a group of teenagers launched a social media campaign, using videos of Harmony Row to rally public support. The mural, now a symbol citywide, became the backdrop for interviews, fundraisers, and advocacy events. And still, the opposition pressed forward. One morning, a luxury SUV parked on the block and 2 men in suits got out, knocking on doors with offers that sounded sweet. Cash sales, no inspections, promises of upgraded properties and revitalization. But neighbors shut their doors politely, some with pride, others with fire. One woman told them, "We've been waiting decades for someone to care, and now that we do, you don't get to buy it back." The tipping point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The holding company filed for a zoning variance that would allow them to build a large multi-unit complex on the corner, claiming it would bring economic vibrancy to the area. The hearing was set for the following week. Harold and Denise spent the next 7 days preparing like it was war. They gathered signatures, assembled documentation, printed renderings of what Harmony Row would look like completed, community gardens, shared green spaces, small businesses in renovated storefronts. The night before the hearing, the Jenkins house buzzed with quiet intensity. Mr. Walker sat at the dining table reviewing statements. Denise paced the hallway with a folder of exhibits. Harold stood at the window, watching rain fall on the block, knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything could change. The hearing was packed. The room swelled with supporters, neighbors, reporters, activists, and more than a few curious developers pretending to be passive observers. When Harold stood to speak, the room fell silent. "We didn't build Harmony Row to make a point," he began. "We built it because we were tired of asking for a place to belong. We took homes that had been forgotten and gave them back to the people. And we did it without a dime of corporate help. Now that it's working, you want to reshape it into something we won't recognize. But we are not a blank canvas. We are not a line item. We are a community, and we're not going anywhere." Denise followed with a speech that wove together numbers, testimonies, and the legacy of neighborhoods that had thrived until they were priced into extinction. By the end, even the stone-faced chairwoman of the zoning board seemed moved. The decision came 3 days later. The variance was denied. The holding company withdrew their bid. Harmony Row had held. That night, the block erupted in celebration. Not loud, not wild, but deeply joyful. Children danced on the sidewalks. Neighbors brought out dishes of food. Maya handed out lemonade in tiny paper cups. And Harold, standing beside Denise beneath the mural that had come to mean everything, felt a quiet, powerful peace settle in his chest. They had crossed the line from dreamers to defenders. And the future, at last, felt truly theirs. The air was soft with the scent of freshly cut grass and the slow bloom of early spring when Harmony Row gathered once again. Not for a meeting, not for a protest or a build day, but for a celebration. Folding chairs lined the sidewalks, paper lanterns swung gently from porch rails, and children raced between garden beds and chalk-drawn hopscotch boards. There were no television crews this time, no politicians or reporters asking questions. This moment wasn't for headlines. It was for them, for the people who had built it, defended it, lived it. Harold stood near the mural, his hand brushing the edge of the wall as he looked up at the cascade of color that now told the story of a block reborn. Faces of ancestors, symbols of strength, scenes of restoration all swirled together like history and hope in motion. He remembered the first time they stood on this very corner, looking at crumbling rooftops and empty lots, wondering if their dream was foolish or too big. Now the dream looked back at him in full color, more vivid than he had ever imagined. Denise joined him, her arm wrapping around his. She wore a white sundress with sunflower embroidery and a gold necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. The same woman who used to say, "Plant roots where they once pulled them up." Today, that promise lived in every footstep, every window, every brick. Maya, now taller and sharper in her questions, stood behind a small podium near the garden she had helped create. She cleared her throat, holding a few note cards that fluttered in the breeze. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice both nervous and strong. "I know I'm still a kid, and maybe I don't have all the fancy words yet, but I want to say thank you. Thank you for building something I get to be proud of. I used to think home was just where you slept, but now I know it's where people see you, really see you, and care enough to keep you safe." Her words brought a stillness to the gathering, one that settled in the chest and stayed there like a heartbeat. Mr. Walker, leaning on his cane, stood slowly and took the microphone. Age had curved his back and softened his gait, but nothing could dim the fire in his voice. "This block," he said, "used to be a ghost town, not just in buildings but in spirit. Then came two people who didn't accept no, who didn't run when the gate closed. They climbed the fence, knocked down walls, and laid a foundation no one can take away. This," he gestured wide with his free hand, "this is what it looks like when a dream refuses to die." The crowd erupted in applause, not the kind that comes from politeness, but the kind that comes from deep recognition, the kind that rises up from lived experience. Harold and Denise exchanged a glance that held years of shared struggle, quiet sacrifices, and the kind of love that's forged in the heat of purpose. Later that evening, as the sun sank low and golden light stretched across Harmony Row, Harold walked the length of the block. He paused at each house, remembering the work behind every one. The hours spent sanding, painting, patching. He nodded at Dre, now running a landscaping business with two friends, his truck parked proudly out front. He waved to Tanya, who had opened a sewing co-op in one of the restored garages. Children laughed in the distance, music spilled from windows, and for a moment, the world outside the street seemed far away. Denise called out to him from the porch. "You coming?" He smiled and turned back, but not before taking one last look. Not to admire, but to remember, to etch it into himself. This wasn't just their victory, it was their offering. The next day, a letter arrived in the mail. Not from a bank, not from a lawyer or a city agency, but from the very real estate firm that had once turned them away. Walter's company, in fact. The letter was brief. A congratulatory note, veiled in civility, offering to partner on future urban revitalization efforts. Harold read it twice, then passed it to Denise, who chuckled softly. "They always come knocking when the house is already warm," she said. We don't need their key, Harold replied. We built the door. That night, they sat together on the porch, just the two of them, as fireflies blinked across the yard and the streetlights flickered on one by one. Do you think people will remember what this was before? Denise asked. Harold thought for a moment. Maybe, but what matters is what they remember now. Not what it was, but what it became. Across the street, Maya sat on the swing, sketchbook in her lap, drawing a new picture of the block. Not with broken windows or boarded doors, but with open arms, smiling faces, and light everywhere. Harmony Row, once denied a future, had become a monument to what could happen when two people refused to believe they were small. And in that refusal, they made room for everyone else to believe the same. And that, my friends, is the incredible journey of Harmony Row. A story that began with a no and ended with a community reborn. It's a reminder that even when doors are closed, even when the world tries to define your worth, you can still build something beautiful, something lasting, something bigger than anyone expected. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We truly appreciate you listening all the way through and hope this story touched your heart the way it touched ours. If you found meaning, inspiration, or even just a moment of reflection in this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and most importantly, leaving a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moved you? What made you pause? Or even a story from your own life that deserves to be told. Your voice matters here. Your story matters. And together, we can keep building a community where every story is seen, heard, and valued. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep believing in better.